I just was really concerned that we were going to see a pendulum shift away from some of the progress that the city's made over the last sort of decade or so.
This episode of Bring Back the Porch, brought to you by Bernie Leahy, River Street Realty. Let's get you home. Adam Koch is our guest today on the Porch. Adam is one of many people who is seeking a seat on Medicinehat City Council. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
First question I have is, what's your passion?
Oh, wow. Well, hospitality is my passion. I've been in the restaurant industry since I was 14 years old. And so the customer service aspect, the creativity around food, all the good things that restaurants provide in terms of just sort of like community and connection, I think that's definitely what I'm passionate about.
So what is your life experience so far led you to this decision, and how would that help you if you were to elect to city council?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I think the biggest thing is that I've got a pretty diverse background. I lived in Toronto for a long time, even though I'm born and raised here. And so I've worked with a lot of teams from all over the world with competing priorities, many different personality types, and always been kind of forced to work together for sort of the best way forward for whatever organization I was working for. So I think that really informs how I like to approach things. I'm very collaborative. So
is that what led you to want to seek a seat on city council?
Yeah, I think the biggest reason that I put my name in, because obviously my restaurant's relatively new. The timing isn't necessarily spectacular, but I just was really concerned that we were going to see a pendulum shift away from some of the progress that the city's made over the last sort of decade or so. And I just want to make sure that we don't sort of forget the people who are often left behind when we make purely fiscal and business-related decisions.
So you're a people candidate?
Very much so, yeah.
Okay. One of the things that we have seen, and I know you've been involved in this on social media already, is the situation with the homeless and drug users, etc. I don't know if there's a solution out there. There's not an easy solution, but where do you stand on that?
Well, I'll echo that. There certainly isn't an easy solution. And obviously, if there was, somebody smarter than me would have figured it out by now, right? So the solutions are definitely complicated. Obviously, a lot of that requires buy-in from the province, philosophically, but also financially, in terms of funding and grants and those kinds of things. So there's a limited amount that the city can do in that space, but leading with sort of those housing first initiatives and compassion and sort of getting out of our own way when it comes to some of the regulatory things, I think that's going to be really important. It's disappointing to see some of the funding cut around things like the McMahon Youth Shelter and those kinds of things, because the wraparound supports, the peripheral supports, are often a part of the solution. They're certainly not the only thing, but they're part of the solution. And so it's disappointing to see, I guess, at least in my view, that the province is kind of going the wrong way on some of these initiatives.
Do you have an ideology politically?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I'm certainly left-leaning, and if you've read anything I've written in terms of blogs and my website content and social media, that's going to be immediately pretty obvious. But I'm not beholden to any sort of one party or any manner of thinking. One of the things I always say is I've got strong opinions that are loosely held.
Any affiliation with any of the other candidates? I know that there has been some talk of, slates of candidates. Right. Are you independent, or are you hoping that you'll join some others who are like-minded?
Proudly independent. I think the issue of collaboration is very interesting, because I've met a whole bunch of the candidates already. Obviously, we share a lot of the same values, but I have no formal alliance, and I have no interest in a formal alliance. So if I was approached by anyone wanting to form a formalized slate, I would absolutely decline, even though in those conversations there are a lot of ways in which I align with some of the other candidates out there.
Okay. Going back to the issue with the homeless and whatnot, there has been a suggestion that they move the mustard seat up to the Briar Park area, the old youth hostel, labor hall. Good idea, bad idea?
I'm in favor of it in principle. I do want to see, there's some community concerns around things like transportation and some of the support services, and how the logistics of that being sort of right on the outskirts of town is going to come to fruition. But I think some of the major concerns around where the mustard seed was operating was that it was right in very sort of, not a densely populated, but certainly a primarily residential area. And obviously the sort of social disorder that can come from that was really concerning to the residents and some of the business owners nearby. So, my understanding is that it's supposed to be an emergency shelter, and obviously there's lots of agencies around the city, the police included, who will provide transportation to folks that do need that service. So I don't know if I have a complete objection to where it's being placed. It's probably the best available solution, given that it's not in close proximity to an awful lot of residential. I know there's some condos down the road, but I think that those concerns can be mitigated in a way that is much more difficult when it's sort of in the downtown core.
Yeah, I think you mentioned earlier about red tape and getting things done in this city. What do you think needs to be done there?
Yeah, well, I did sort of say, we have to kind of get out of our own way. And I think that that's something that's pretty important. I know from my experience, when we were renovating our building to open our business, my sister and I, being we found that even though we were using a very well-experienced general contractor, he still faced some of those issues that people are identifying with City Hall. So you'd sometimes get a different answer depending on, who you asked a question to. And some of those inconsistencies were really frustrating because it caused some of the, the trades and stuff that were lined up to be delayed, and it delayed the overall project. So, I don't have a lot in the way of specifics, but I'd certainly like to see some communication between the departments at City Hall or within the city. One of the things that some other candidates have been talking about, and I've actually spoken with one of the managing directors about, is I likened it to sort of like a sales rep, because that's my hospitality background coming out, but somebody else mentioned it as almost like a business concierge. So a single point of contact through which all the communication with City Hall can filter, and then that person can reach out to relevant departments and really help to just kind of work on some of those logistics and make things a bit more efficient. And I'm definitely in favor of that.
What has your experience been with dealing with the people in City Hall?
Well, I was a city employee for 3 years. When I moved back from Toronto, I was the food and beverage manager for Co-op Place in the Esplanade. And so I've got a little bit of that kind of internal perspective because I was a manager at kind of the mid-level within the city structure. I think the overwhelming majority of people are just there to do good work. They're professionals in their space, and they show up wanting to do the best that they can. Sometimes they just get hyper-focused on their own departments, their own teams, and their own tasks, and they don't necessarily see the bigger picture of how some of the siloing and the inefficiency of communication sort of gets in the way of progress when it comes to outside interests, right? When businesses or folks trying to do home development and those kinds of things, they just don't necessarily see how they're creating those inefficiencies.
So we need somebody to sort of lead the orchestra at City Hall.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's the way that the structure, when you look at the org structure, that's the way it's supposed to work. There's a very sort of pyramid structure from the CAO on down. And so on paper, it should work really efficiently, and there should be a kind of interdepartmental communication, but sometimes there's just not.
Have you watched closely the council over the last couple of years? Have you attended meetings on a regular basis?
Yes, more so in the last probably 4 to 5 months. I've been a regular in person. I've watched a great many more than that on kind of YouTube and live streaming where that's available. Because sometimes I just can't attend in person. So yeah, I've definitely kind of got my finger on the pulse. I think my interest kind of peaked initially during some of those initial really awkward meetings between council and the CAO and some of the controversy around there I guess it would have been almost exactly 2 years ago, right around kind of fall of 23. So that's really when I started to pay a lot more attention than I had been prior.
Okay. One of the big things that this new council is going to have to sort out is whether or not we want to remove the administration of the utilities to a municipally controlled corporation, the MCC, the initials, the acronym.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
I am in favor of the MCC, and I mentioned that I'm kind of a left-leaning person, so on paper I probably shouldn't be. But I initially had a lot of questions around it, and I went to some of the open houses and the engagement sessions that the city had done, and I had the opportunity to speak with Managing Director Pancoast, and she really addressed a lot of the concerns that I had and some of the other residents I was sitting at tables with. I think that some of the arguments that have been made around council's ability to be the manager of the business as well as the rate setter does create a little bit of an inherent conflict, because their responsibility is to sort of more than one group of stakeholders. So I'm definitely in favor of it. More than anything, I'm happy that council made a decision around it. I didn't want it to become this all-consuming election issue that was sort of the only thing we were talking about, and it would take a lot of the oxygen out of the room. So I'm happy that they've made the decision. And they had the option of maybe spinning out the rate review committee, which I see as maybe a half measure, but I just don't know that it has the same effectiveness if that corporation doesn't exist as kind of a separate entity. So I'm a little bit torn on the RRC.
A pocketbook issue for everybody is utility rates and property taxes. And absolutely. How does Adam Koch look at those?
Utility rates, I think we still pay overall relatively low utilities. And so I think that in some ways we've retained our Medicine Hat advantage. I know that those rates are going up. I'm a rate payer and I'm a business owner. So I fully understand that those rates have gone up. But in some ways we're victims of just the commodity market, and that's just kind of how it works. I think when it comes to property taxes, I would really like to see that indexed to inflation. It strikes me that we did 3 years of zero increases, and now we're sort of having to right fit that with a couple of years of 5.6, and that's a pretty big spike for a lot of folks. So if we were to index that to inflation and have it be a little bit more regular and a little bit more measurable, I think that people could stomach annual increases that were more sort of in that 1.5, 1.9, 2.1 range, because it's a little bit more predictable. And again, if it's indexed to inflation, then you have a kind of a signal of where that's going to go every year.
One thing when you're budgeting, you can either cut your expenses or you can increase your revenue, and that leads us into economic development.
Yeah.
How would you, if you were to be elected, be a proponent to bring business and investment to Medicine Hat?
Yeah, that's another one of those ones that if there was a simple solution, we would have thought of it, right? We haven't seen meaningful population growth in the better part of a decade. And, there haven't been an awful lot of massive businesses that have invested in the city in about the same period of time. But there was a time that we were obviously very attractive, right? When you look at the sort of Methanex and CF and Goodyear and Big Marble, and Chinook greenhouses, like there's some awfully big businesses that do a lot of revenue and employ a lot of people. So there was definitely a time when businesses wanted to be here. I've heard anecdotally that sometimes when foreign investors are looking here, we don't have a plan for an alternate source of energy. And so, again, I don't have sort of stats or facts to back this one up, but anecdotally, I've heard that that's a little bit of a barrier. And I know that the question around solar is probably going to come up in the course of the interview, but I think that would be one of many steps. In some ways, it's just about celebrating what we already have as well. I mean, we have 2 intersecting highways. We have proximity to BC, the U.S. border, Calgary, Saskatchewan. So I think that we actually do have a pretty good situation, and the cost of living and the cost of doing business overall, again, is relatively low. So in some ways, it's a bit of a mystery as to how we don't have more of that kind of investment. One thing that I'm slightly concerned about is I don't necessarily want to incentivize that in sort of waiving offsite levies or incentivizing with utility rate reductions or tax reductions and those kinds of things. Because my concern there is that a company comes in, takes advantage of those things, and then pulls up or doesn't expand their business as soon as those incentives run out.
Would you be a salesperson as a councillor for the city of Medicine Hat?
Absolutely. That's one of the roles I think is super important, and particularly in the mayor's chair. But I think councillors as well, we would all need to be ambassadors for the city. I really want to see that team Medicine Hat mentality. And that speaks a little bit to leadership as well, because in some ways, again, especially with the mayor, there's kind of a symbolic position there. The mayor doesn't have substantially more power than any other councillor. And so what I would really like to see in the next mayor is that unifying force and that person that really gets out there and says, look, this is a great place to live, and we're all on Team Medicine Hat, and we want everybody in the province and the rest of the country to know it.
So that leads me to a question. Do you have a preferred candidate for mayor?
I genuinely don't at the moment. I know that just seems like a non-answer, but I'm really torn. I've met with 4 of the candidates kind of one-on-one. And then I've had very brief interactions with 2 other ones. Again, I'm looking for that leadership person, right? I'm looking for that unifying force and that kind of coach that you can rally behind. And I don't know that any of the 6 have clearly defined themselves in that way for me just yet. And there's an awful lot of opportunity for them to do so. The upcoming forum this week is going to be a really important piece for that.
The Salmon Solar Project, you alluded to it a moment ago.
Yeah.
Some see it as a boondoggle, some see it as an investment in our future. How about Adam Koch?
I'm very much on the side of investment in our future. I've said multiple times, and this is maybe an unpopular position, but I think the 1900s were the sort of century of oil, and I think the 2000s will be looked upon as the century of renewables. And it strikes me that there is a really big upfront cost to this, and I'm fully aware of that. But I think the payoff, the life of these kinds of systems runs in the sort of 20 to 25 year neighborhood. And I think once we get past the first couple of years, it should pay for itself, and we should be able to actually profit quite considerably by selling excess power back to the grid, particularly if we make an investment that has enough capacity. Because I know that the initial conversation is around kind of the 75 range right now. I'd like to see that a little bit higher, because 75 sort of just covers the current need. And I'd certainly like to see that higher. I mean, we have the sunniest city in Canada, so how are we not taking advantage of that?
Do you think that the city has done a good job in communicating with the public? I'm thinking of the traffic calming, the Division Avenue that people have been grumbling about ever since they took the barriers down and let people go on the road.
Yeah, they can do more, certainly. So there are opportunities to engage online. The city is pretty diligent about surveys. The Shape Your City website that has dedicated pages for all of those various projects. I really do think that they are attempting to put the information out there. There's a little bit of that. It has to be a bit of a participation sport as well. So people have to also do their homework and find the information. Probably they could do more of those in-person feedback and engagement sessions and stuff, but I've attended an awful lot of them, and depending on the subject and sometimes depending on the time of day and that kind of thing, I went to the one for the Southside Rec Center at the library. I was there for about an hour, and I think I saw 8 people. So I don't necessarily know that the argument that we should do a whole bunch of those if only 8 people are going to attend is necessarily prudent for us. But I certainly think that they can do more, and I think that speaks a little bit to the transparency thing. The flip side to that is that you have to make sure that you're actually listening to the feedback that you're getting. So if those sessions are just purely performative, then I think people will start to mistrust them. So I'd certainly like to see some of the feedback taken into account, and then some of that communication being, as a result of the feedback, here's some changes that we've made.
So do you think the public might have a perception that the city's just paying lip service and they're going to do what they want to do regardless of what I might say at a public meeting or an open house?
Yeah, certainly on social media, that seems to be the overall tone. I don't know that I necessarily agree wholeheartedly with that, because, again, going back to the idea that the individual folks who work for the city, I think, are genuinely trying to do good work. And I think that they are trying to be responsive. But, the public's interest can only go so far. We have to remember that the public sort of writ large, and I include myself in this, are not experts in the majority of these subjects, right? And so you also have to listen to engineers and city planners and other levels of government. And, there's the folks that are doing this work in the design phases and even in collecting the feedback are also needing to be responsive to all those other considerations. So just because a certain contingent of the public doesn't like something doesn't automatically make it the wrong answer.
This has been dubbed as probably the most important election in the history of Medicine Hat. For your final few minutes here, what is the biggest issue for Adam Koch looking into the next 4 years?
Well, I don't know that I accept that premise, first off, because I suspect that we say that every election. It probably makes really good headlines, but this is certainly a big one. I mean, there's an awful lot of public interest, and certainly with 39 or 40 council candidates, it's obvious that there's a lot of interest in this and in the future of the city. So Of course I'm taking that very seriously as a candidate, and I wouldn't be here if I didn't believe strongly in our future. I have every intention of staying here for the rest of my life. I made a very deliberate decision to move back here and open a business here, even though there were plenty of other options throughout the country, right? And I know that people often want to reach out and talk about very hyper-specific things, but I think one of the things that's really important to me is really refocusing on what councils do, but importantly, what they don't do. And sometimes that's where the disconnect happens with the public, is that, they think that a councillor is just going to reach down and pave their road or, reverse some decision, and councillors can't do anything unilaterally. And so it kind of goes back to that Team Medicine Hat thing a little bit in terms of being an ambassador, and just really making sure that the people around that horseshoe are trying to make the best decisions for the city with the best available information. But, on top of that, the collaboration and the communication is equally important, because we have to signal that we are trustworthy, right? And we haven't really talked about sort of FOIP and that transparency issue so much, but I do think those things are important. And one of the things I'd love to see is, let's just share more information by default, so that people don't feel the need to be FOIPing requests all the time. And you could consider that maybe frivolous, but I think it's just that there's some really interested people that want the information. So let's proactively put it out there. A public service and a municipality shouldn't be hiding anything from people. Obviously, there's some proprietary information, and there's things like personnel issues that can't be discussed openly. But beyond that, why are we not discussing these things out in the open? I want to see a reduction in closed meetings unless they're absolutely necessary. And I certainly want to see a reduction in the gatekeeping of information. I think that a city website should have everything you could possibly imagine to try to find. And again, sometimes it requires citizens to do the homework, but I don't see any reason not to share information with people.
Adam Koch, a candidate for Medicine Hat City Council on October 20th. Thank you.
Thank you so much.